In the scorched lands of southern Afghanistan, where the air burned under a relentless sun and every gust carried red dust and the lingering scent of old gunpowder, Jake Carter, a Marine sergeant, walked a razor-thin line between life and death. One misstep could mean the end. His world was no longer measured in days or nights, but in missions, and the names that never came back. Beside Jake was Shadow, a specially trained war dog, a male Belgian Malinois with dark fur and a compact, muscular body like a living biological weapon. But to Jake, Shadow wasn't a weapon. He was a friend, a brother in arms. The only reason Jake held on to a shred of humanity each morning amid the battlefield chaos. Shadow didn't bark much. He didn't need to. The connection between Jake and Shadow transcended words, built on looks, subtle gestures, and small signs. Shadow's eyes were amber, deep and calm, as if he'd seen the whole world and still chose to stay by Jake's side. They had completed over 50 missions together: mine detection, identifying explosives, and locating hidden tunnels. On some nights, Jake slept in a freezing trench, his head resting on a backpack, while Shadow curled tightly against him, his warm breath on Jake's wrist the only reminder that he was still alive. Then came the day that changed everything. The mission seemed simple: check a small village nestled between two dunes, supposedly abandoned by the Taliban. Jake led the team, Shadow at the front, tethered to him not just by a leash, but by something stronger than any military order: trust. As they entered the village outskirts, Shadow froze. His hackles rose, nose to the ground, ears taut, waiting for something. Jake signaled an immediate stop. "Something's wrong," he whispered. Shadow let out a faint, low whine, the final warning. No one had time to react. Shadow launched forward, his body like a living arrow. Jake saw him leap straight toward a rock by the roadside, right as a sharp click pierced the air, the unmistakable sound of a mine triggering. Boom! The explosion shook the ground like a quake. Shards of metal screamed through the air, everything blurred. Dust and smoke choked the light. Jake was thrown off his feet, ears ringing. He scrambled up, feet slipping on the sand, heart pounding like a war drum. "Shadow?" he called out hoarsely, like a lost child in a crowd. No answer. Only a charred scrap of armor, a smear of blood on the sand, and the broken leash, still warm. Shadow never came back. Jake collapsed to the ground. No commands, no tactics, no one left to lead. He let out a cry, not a name, but a sound from the gut, the raw wail of a soul losing what it never dared to love, yet loved more than life itself. They brought him back to base the next day. The doctor said it was a mild concussion, but the deeper wound wasn't in his bones. It lay in the nights that followed. When Jake lay in darkness imagining Shadow's footsteps, the soft scratch of paws on concrete, or the warm lick waking him from another nightmare. Jake never cried in front of his squad, but he did, for the first time, when he received Shadow's ashes. They came in a small tin, engraved with the words, "For loyalty beyond duty." From then on, Jake carried a piece of Shadow with him, not just in memory, but in the silent void no one else could fill. He returned to the U.S. months later, pulled from the battlefield, pulled from society, pulled from himself. And he didn't know that fate would one day lead him to another four-legged soul, also abandoned in a storm, also torn apart by life. But this time, Jake wouldn't let anyone slip away again. Jake Carter's return came with no letter and no call ahead. He left the battlefield like a shadow, quiet, no farewells, not even a parting hug from his comrades. Coming home wasn't a new beginning. It was the silent end of something that had died inside him long ago. His mother's house sat tucked behind old pine trees on the edge of Elk Hollow, a sleepy town with wooden rooftops and dirt roads prone to landslides in the rain. His mother had died of a stroke years ago. Since then, time has layered dust over the place. No one lived there. No one crossed the doorstep. Only the wind rustled the trees in the back, and now and then, a woodpecker tapped gently at the fading walls. Jake returned, not out of love for the place, but because there was nowhere else to go. He didn't repair the house, didn't repaint the walls, didn't replant the chrysanthemums his mother once cherished. He left everything untouched, frozen in the moment she passed, like the past was the only thing he had the strength to hold on to, even if it brought nothing but cold silence. Every morning began with a sigh. He didn't set alarms. His sleep was shattered nightly by nightmares. Some nights he'd jolt awake, cold sweat soaking his shirt, hands trembling, mouth calling a name no one would answer. Shadow. In those dreams, he relived the dusty chaos of Afghanistan, the thunderclap of a landmine, and that familiar body vanishing into darkness, never to return. They weren't just nightmares. They were memories so vivid, he could still smell the gunpowder and feel Shadow's final breath on his hand. He spoke to no one. Didn't turn on the TV, didn't check social media. Now and then, someone in the small town would whisper, "Carter's back. He was such a smart kid now, he's changed." But no one approached him. And Jake didn't let anyone close. In the dusty kitchen sat a small ceramic bowl, once used to hold water for Shadow whenever they were home on leave. No one asked why he kept it, but every time he passed by, his eyes lingered, as if still waiting for a wet tongue at the rim, a gently wagging tail, a slow, steady breath curled up at the foot of the bed. One night, in heavy rain, Jake sat quietly on the porch steps, watching the water stream from the gutters. No umbrella, no warmth, just his eyes fixed on the blurred horizon, as if waiting for a familiar shape to return. But no one came. Only the sound of rain drumming on the old wood and the silent thud of a heart trying to endure one more day without breaking. An army doctor had once recommended PTSD therapy. He had a list of specialists ready to help, but Jake never called. "I'm not crazy," he told himself. "I just don't want to live again." There's a thin but powerful line between living and merely existing. Jake chose the latter, because he believed his heart had been buried with Shadow in that Middle Eastern soil. Yet deep inside, something hadn't fully died. Maybe it was the way Shadow used to look at him after each mission, not with fear or obedience, but belief. The belief that Jake was a good man, that he deserved to live, deserved forgiveness, not from others but from himself. That belief, buried under ashes of memory, still smoldered, like an ember refusing to go out. And one rainy night, much like the others, something would be different. Somewhere out there, another lost soul waited in the storm, also four-legged, also weary, also done believing in kindness. And that storm would become the bridge between two survivors, a man who had lost his faith and a dog waiting for one last miracle. The rain that night wasn't just water falling from the sky. It was a silent score to a reunion fate had quietly waited on for a very long time. After a late-night shift at the town's auto repair garage, Jake Carter drove his old pickup through narrow, dark, and empty roads. Rain poured down in sheets, drumming so hard against the windshield that it seemed to swallow the world beyond. The clock read a little past 1 a.m. Trees lining the roadside swayed like bowed shadows in the night, and the flickering streetlights fought to survive the storm's fury. Jake didn't hate the rain. On the contrary, it blurs the edges of everything, letting memories dissolve like dust on skin. But tonight felt different. Whether it was instinct or the sixth sense of someone who'd survived ambushes and firefights, something made Jake tense as he turned the familiar corner. A dark alleyway wedged between two abandoned houses. A chill traced his spine. He eased the brake, eyes scanning where his headlights sliced through the downpour. And then he saw it. A metal crate, tipped on its side, lodged in a flooded ditch. Under the faint glow, rusted bars glinted like the ribcage of some long-forgotten creature. At first, Jake thought it was just debris. trash or a discarded item carried off by the flood. But something held his gaze. Something inside was struggling, or more accurately, fading. Jake slammed the brakes, threw open the door, and rushed into the rainstorm. The wind slapped his face with icy fists. Water reached his knees. His thick coat soaked quickly, growing heavier by the second. But he didn't stop. The crate was half submerged, being tugged sideways by the rising water. Inside, a large dog with dark fur, drenched and trembling, lay curled up. Its head rested against a corner of the crate, eyes reduced to thin slits in the dark. Emaciated, its ribs jutted sharply through taut skin. One hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. Jake dropped to his knees beside the crate. The water was frigid, but his chest burned. He slid his fingers through the bars, brushing the dog's muzzle. No response. He moved his touch to its chest. There it was. A heartbeat, faint but still there, as if life had shrunk to a flickering thread, swaying in the storm. "God," Jake whispered, heart flashing back to another moment, an afternoon in Kandahar when Shadow lay motionless in a crater of red soil after saving his life. No, not again. He couldn't watch another life give up in front of him. Jake tugged at the latch, but it was rusted shut. He pulled out his pocket knife, wedging the blade against the lock while bracing the bottom of the crate with his foot. Rain lashed down harder. Water climbed higher. The dog let out a low, gurgled sound. Not a whine, but a breath trapped between survival and surrender. "No, you don't get to die here," Jake growled, arms straining. Then crack! The latch snapped off in his hand. He crouched lower and slid both arms beneath the dog, so light he felt like lifting a soaked coat, not a living creature. It quivered in his hold. Its eyes fluttered open briefly, gazing at Jake as if to ask, "Who are you and why did you come back for me?" Jake didn't answer. He just held the dog close and ran back to the truck. Under the headlights' glow, the image of two souls, a wounded man and a forsaken dog, cut through the storm, leaving behind a moment neither would forget. As the door shut behind them, warmth began to seep into the fragile body curled against Jake's chest. He wrapped the dog in his coat and turned the heater up. He didn't know if this was instinct or something deeper, a reflex of a heart that had long frozen over and now cracked wide open. He didn't know the dog's name, didn't know who had abandoned it in that metal prison, drifting in nature's fury. But he knew this. It wasn't dead, and as long as it was alive, there was hope. "We're going home," Jake whispered, eyes locked on the blurry road ahead. "This time I won't lose you like I lost Shadow." Inside the truck, only the rain's rhythm on the roof and the dog's faint breath under the coat remained. But for Jake, it was the most beautiful symphony he'd heard in years of broken silence. No sirens, no squad, just one man and one fragile soul, caught in the storm, balanced between life and death. Jake Carter, in his rain-soaked military jacket, stood frozen for a moment before the rusted crate tilted in the icy current of a narrow alley stream. The downpour whipped across his face, trying to drown every last effort into despair. But Jake no longer felt cold. No hesitation. All his senses locked on one thing, the murky brown eyes staring up at him through the bars. The dog lay half submerged, its head resting on a bent iron bar, panting shallowly. Its once wolf-like coat was soaked, caked with mud, and speckled with dried blood. Scratches etched across its neck and forelegs glistened under the truck's beam. No barking, no whimpering, just a gaze. No blame, no surrender, just a whisper. "I'm still here if someone wants to try." Jake's breath caught. His eyes scanned the crate, padlock rusted solid, slick with moss and dirt. He yanked it. It didn't budge. Dropping to his knees in the current, he searched blindly. His fingers found a broken brick near the wall, lying like it had waited for this exact moment. He grabbed it, wiped the moss off, and clenched it tight. The first strike rang out. Clang! Metal shivered but held. Jake clenched his jaw and stared down at the lock like it was holding the dog's life hostage. Again. And again. Rain roared around him, but Jake didn't stop. "Don't die before I get this open, you hear me?" he muttered, unsure if to the dog or himself. Then he heard it, a sound so faint it barely existed. A whimper. The dog stirred. Eyes opened wider. One paw twitched. Jake paused, breath caught. Then, with a roar, he brought the brick down one last time, filled with fury, grief, and desperate hope. Crack! The lock burst, clattering into the stream and vanishing into the dark. Without delay, Jake swung the crate door open. A foul, rotting stench hit him. He reached in, right arm under the dog's neck, left arm cradling its belly, lifting as gently as he could. The dog was frighteningly light. Not with the lightness of something small, but the terrifying weightlessness of a body barely clinging to life. The fur peeled off in patches. One leg hung limp, grotesquely bent. But as Jake pulled the dog close, its head drooped, then slowly turned, resting against his chest. Jake stood, rain pouring down his face, down his back. He didn't shake. At that moment, every old ghost, explosions, gunpowder, shadow diving through fire, all came back, but each step he took now wasn't into memory. It was out of trauma. He couldn't remember how many steps it took to get to the truck, only that he never let the dog go, never let the rain touch its head again. The truck door swung open. The warmth from the heater spilled like an embrace for two souls pulled back from the brink. Jake laid the dog gently on the passenger seat, cushioning its back with the driest jacket he had. His hand trembled as he brushed its forehead, ears, and thin shoulders. "Good. You're a good one. I won't let you die." The dog let out a soft moan. Eyes opened wider. No brightness, no reaction, just movement, enough to know it was still trying. Jake started the engine. Headlights tore through the darkness. He glanced over and realized the dog was looking at him. Truly looking. Not with the dazed endurance of pain, but with the fragile gaze of something daring to believe in someone again. Jake's breath caught in his chest. "We're going to live, you hear me? I survived the war. You're going to survive this night, I promise." And in that moment, in a truck warmed by breath and burning resolve, while the storm raged outside, two survivors looked into each other. No languages needed, no understanding of species, just an unspoken vow. If you don't give up, neither will I. Jake's truck raced through the pouring rain like it was crossing an invisible war zone, not with bullets or explosions, but with screaming wind and water battering the windshield like artillery. To Jake, this storm wasn't so different from the sandstorms of Kandahar. Chaotic, blinding, and capable of deciding life or death in an instant. In the passenger seat, curled up in the old military coat Jake always kept in the trunk like a charm from another life, the small dog no longer stirred. Its body lay limp, the only sign of life being the faint rise and fall beneath the soaked fabric. Jake glanced over. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his fingers trembled slightly. For the first time in years, he was afraid of losing something he didn't even understand yet. He pulled over suddenly beneath the awning of a closed auto shop, sheltering from the downpour that now fell in torrents. The alley behind him was swallowed by the storm. No sirens, no flashes, just the heavy silence of a veteran alone with a heart he didn't know how to handle. Jake reached into the glove compartment and pulled out an old towel and a bottle of water he kept from his days working construction. Slowly, he unscrewed the cap, poured a few drops into his palm, and leaned over to the dog, whimpering softly beneath the sodden layers. Its eyes were half closed, lashes stuck together, and its entire body looked like it could break under its weight. Jake gently slipped a hand under its neck, lifting the head. The skin beneath its wet fur was chilling. He pressed his other hand against its forehead, not to check for fever, but out of some long-forgotten instinct. A touch of life, fragile as a flame flickering in a storm. "Come on, just a little," he murmured, like coaxing a child. and like a small miracle, the dog's tongue peeked out, lapping weakly at the water in his hand. Jake froze. Life had never screamed, never begged, never demanded attention. It was always this quiet. That was what broke him. He tucked the coat more snugly around the dog, the same coat he had worn the last time Shadow led a patrol. Inside the coat was a hand-stitched seam his mother had repaired during her final year, and now it was keeping warm a nameless, ownerless, abandoned creature, one that, in this world, no one was supposed to be waiting for. Jake lowered his head and met the dog's vacant gaze. For a moment, time stalled between their eyes, one too familiar with loss, the other clinging to breath. And Jake realized, this dog wasn't begging. It wasn't asking to be saved. It simply lay there, silently saying, "If you walk away, I won't blame you. But if you try, I'll try too." Jake reached out and touched its forehead, his dry, calloused palm resting on cold, wet fur. It felt like a pact. And then, so quietly, he surprised himself that the words still lived in his throat. He whispered, "Storm." He repeated it, this time clearly, like a naming ritual in some sacred rite. "Your name is Storm." He looked into its eyes. "Because you were born from a storm. Because you didn't give up. Because even caged, abandoned, and broken, you stayed. You didn't bark. You didn't bite. You waited." The dog didn't answer. But Jake saw it, clear as day, a glisten at the edge of its eye. Not rain, not mist, but the look of a being that had walked to the edge of death and still chose to trust. The look only survivors carry. He laid his head back down on the towel and brushed a hand softly from its forehead down to its nose. "Storm," he whispered again, this time a vow. "This time you won't fight alone." The truck rolled forward slowly, heading toward the old house, the one guarded only by peeling paint and memories of war. But tonight, Jake was bringing something different home, a life in need of saving, and a reason to be saved himself. Inside the cabin, with the rain easing into a gentle rhythm, Jake felt something shift. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. And for the first time in years, he called something by a name that wasn't rank, wasn't Shadow, but Storm. A dog, a storm, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance. By the time Jake's truck pulled up to the old wooden house on the edge of town, the rain had thinned. Only soft drops clicked off the tin roof into the puddles below. He opened the passenger door and gently lifted Storm from the seat, arms wrapped like he was holding a piece of shattered porcelain. The coat around the dog's frail body did little against the cold that had already sunk into its bones. But what Jake noticed most wasn't the chill. It was how light the dog was, light like a starved soul. He pushed open the door, didn't turn on the living room light, and followed the soft glow from the kitchen instead. Everything was as it always had been. Worn couch, chipped paint, crooked photos of his mother and the unit. But tonight, something in the air had shifted. No words, no plan. But Jake knew where he needed to go. The bathroom, the only room with hot water and enough light to face the truth he now cradled in his arms. He laid Storm on a towel spread across the tiled floor. The fluorescent light flickered with a pop, then glowed, falling over Storm's body like an examination lamp. And Jake found he couldn't breathe. Storm, no longer shrouded by shadow or cloth, was revealed in full, like a map etched in pain. Patches of its brown-black fur were missing, revealing skin that was bruised, grayish, and scarred. Some looked frostbitten, others looked torn and healed wrong. Scars were everywhere, long, jagged, curling across its body like a blade had carved recklessly through flesh. A section of skin on its back was thin as paper, puckered from an old, slashed wound. The belly was sunken, each rib protruding like an X-ray-made flesh. Jake stepped back, not from fear, but from a flood of emotions too strong to hold still. Nausea rose, not from disgust, but fury. Who could do this to a creature? He knelt, hands trembling. He brushed the fur on Storm's hind leg, Just as he feared, the left leg was swollen, twisted in a way no healthy limb should be. A break, old and never set. Storm whimpered softly when Jake touched the bruise but didn't pull away. Instead, it looked at him, pale eyes glowing with something strange. Not fear, not resentment, but a question. Will this time be different? Jake whispered. I'm sorry. He didn't know what for. Maybe for the world, maybe for his helplessness, or maybe because Storm had dragged from his soul something he'd buried deep, the image of Shadow, lifeless in his arms on the battlefield. He leaned closer, inspecting each wound. A scar ran across Storm's left ear, not deep, but permanent. A rope burn circled one front leg, an old bind. Near the pelvis, a bruise is still fresh, proof of recent violence. Jake wasn't a vet, but he'd seen tortured bodies. On the battlefield, in enemy prisons, in investigations he helped lead as a military investigator. Storm's body, emaciated, damaged, misshapen, was a silent testimony of pain no living being should ever endure. And Storm had never said a word, never howled, never barked, never protested. It had just laid there, surviving, as if the pain was normal, as if no one was ever coming to save it. Jake reached for a towel and began gently drying Storm's fur. Every stroke was slow and careful, like he was touching a fragile secret. When he reached the back, Storm shivered. Jake paused. It's okay, he whispered. I'm here now. A simple phrase. But Jake knew it wasn't just for Storm. It was for himself. Because from that moment on, everything was different. Storm wasn't just a stray he found in the rain. Storm was a witness, a quiet warrior who had never surrendered. And for Jake, a soldier who had lost everything, this dog was a mirror. Both carried wounds without words. Both survived in silence. They, two fractured souls, had found each other in a storm. And now, under the sterile bathroom light, they both knew. Maybe they weren't just here to heal. Maybe they were here to survive together. When Storm nestled his head into Jake's arm, searching for the last remnants of warmth in the freezing dawn, Jake knew he couldn't wait. The wounds on the dog's body weren't just scars of abuse. They were a warning. Even one more night might cost this fragile life everything. Without another thought, Jake wrapped Storm in a blanket, gently placed him in the truck's passenger seat, and started the engine. The rain had finally eased, only the last drops dripping from the eaves into the frozen ground. The streets were empty, but inside Jake, everything surged. Memories, nerves, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. He drove toward the nearest veterinary clinic, just over 20 minutes away, the only one that accepted emergency patients this early in the morning. Every time he glanced at Storm, he saw those eyes still watching him. Not panicked, not pleading, just that same heartbreaking quiet trust. The clinic's glass door swung open as Jake pushed in, Storm bundled in his arms. The smell of antiseptic hung faintly in the sterile, white-lit room. Only the soft hum of the AC filled the silence. A young nurse approached, still groggy from sleep, but her expression sharpened the moment she saw Storm's injuries. "We need a doctor now," Jake said urgently. His voice was hoarse after a sleepless night. "I just rescued him. He's starved, has a broken rear leg, and signs of infection." "Hold on." The nurse hurried to the back. Less than a minute later, the main exam room door swung open, and time stopped. A woman stepped out in a familiar white coat. Her dark brown hair was tied neatly at the nape of her neck. Her eyes were sharp yet kind, but it was her smile that made Jake freeze. "Jake?" "Emily." Their names fell from their lips as if the world beyond them no longer existed. For a moment the pain in Storm's body, the antiseptic smell, and the harsh lighting vanished beneath the weight of history. Emily stood still, stethoscope in hand. Her eyes flickered from Jake to the soaked dog, then back to him. "What are you doing here?" Jake hesitated, a foreign feeling for a man who had seen war. "I found him last night in a cage. He almost drowned. I didn't know where else to take him." Emily moved forward without another word. She knelt and peeled back the blanket to inspect the wounds. Storm whimpered but didn't resist. Misaligned leg fracture, swelling around the pelvis, likely old, ear infection, and extensive scarring. Jake nodded. He needs help. Emily looked up. Her eyes no longer held the blame they once did, nor were they brimming with tears like the day he left. There was only a calmness. One Jake recognized. It was the very thing that had once made him love her. Bring him to room 3. I'll start an IV and run an initial check. We'll need x-rays and blood work. She turned to the nurse. Page the assistant vet. Prep the table. Jake followed Emily silently into the room. He placed Storm on the exam table, holding the dog's head steady while she prepped the IV. As her fingers brushed the wet fur, Jake saw something flash in her eyes. Not tears, but something deeper. Something that reached past logic. You still work here? He asked softly. After you left, I finished vet school. I stopped wanting to leave town. Not because I was angry, but because I realized a part of my heart stayed here, with the animals who couldn't speak for themselves. Jake looked down, his voice catching. I'm sorry. Emily didn't respond. She gently injected a painkiller into Storm's thigh and wiped the dirt from his eyes with a warm cloth. Storm breathed easier, eyes fixed on her as if sensing a kind of quiet kindness in every touch. Did you give him a name? Emily asked quietly. Jake nodded. Storm. A small smile played on her lips, the same smile Jake had carried with him through the war. Fitting. He survived the storm. Maybe you did too. Jake said nothing. He only looked at Storm. Beneath the white lights, the dog's scars no longer looked monstrous. They looked like medals, silent witnesses of a war fought alone. This dog, like Jake, didn't need pity. They just needed a place where someone believed. Wounds could heal, given enough time, and someone who stayed long enough to see it through. And now, in this quiet, white room, between two people who once let go, a fragile life was stitching back together what had once been broken. After the long and nerve-wracking vet visit, Storm stayed the night for observation. Before leaving, Jake stood by the kennel for a long time, eyes locked on the sleeping dog. Each breath, every slight twitch of the tail, stirred in him something unfamiliar. This fragile life, barely known, had already carved deep into the hardest part of his heart. The next morning, Storm was discharged with stable vitals, and a long list of medications, a nutrition plan, and a detailed follow-up schedule handwritten by Emily. The healing journey had begun, but help would come from an unexpected source. Jake's young neighbor, Ben, 9 years old, from the house next door. Messy brown hair, small frame, always clinging to an old sketchbook. He rarely spoke, a near-complete silence with strangers. His mother, a single parent, once told Jake that Ben had high-functioning autism and struggled with social interactions. But he was exceptionally sensitive to colors and imagery. All summer, Ben sat alone under his porch, drawing dogs over and over. Jake had seen him around, but the boy never initiated contact. Until that afternoon. Storm was lying under the backyard tree, wrapped in a thick blanket, a water bowl beside him. Ben suddenly appeared at the low fence that separated their yards, silent but with eyes that sparkled strangely. Jake was washing up at the outside tap when he noticed the boy standing there, eyes locked on Storm. He was about to say hello, but Ben just nodded and stepped forward, each movement careful, as if afraid of disturbing something sacred. Storm stirred at the sound, but didn't growl or pull away. Instead, he lifted his head and stared at Ben. Calmly, deeply. Ben said nothing. He simply sat down a few feet from Storm, pulled out his crumpled sketchbook, and began to draw. His strokes were slow but deliberate. First, the ears, sharp and alert, then round, soulful eyes. Finally, the curled, breathing pose. Jake didn't have to ask. He knew it was Storm. Strangely, Storm showed no fear. He even inched forward, resting his nose gently near Ben's knee. Both froze like an invisible agreement had just been made. From that day on, Ben came by almost daily. He said little, but every time he sat beside Storm, he drew. One afternoon, when Jake brought water out, Ben looked up and softly said, "This dog's not like the others." Jake paused. It was the first time Ben had spoken to him voluntarily. He sat down beside him and glanced at the drawing. "Why do you think that?" he asked. Ben was quiet for a moment, then answered. Steady voice, bright eyes. "Because he's not scared. The others are always scared, but he looks at me. He waits." Jake didn't know how to respond. He looked at Storm, lying still, eyes half closed, ears perked as if listening. Something was happening between these two beings, a boy with a different mind and a dog once shattered by cruelty. That words couldn't describe. But the connection was deeper than any sentence could reach. A week later, Ben began reading aloud from a children's book while sitting beside Storm. His voice trembled, but with each sentence, Storm would react. A tail flick, a head nudge, or just a slow blink. What brought silent tears to Jake's eyes was one quiet afternoon, when Ben set down his pencil, gently stroked Storm's back, and whispered, "Thank you for listening." Storm licked the boy's hand. That evening, Ben's mother knocked on Jake's door, face overwhelmed with emotion. "Jake, I don't know what Storm did, but Ben has started talking more. He's never read out loud in front of anyone before." Jake just smiled softly, hand resting on Storm's back. He didn't do anything. He was just there. Some wounds, both physical and emotional, don't need medicine to heal. They need presence. Silent, steady, patient presence. Storm had done that for Ben, and Ben, in his innocent honesty, was healing something in Storm, too, the part that still flinched at memories of past pain. Saturday afternoon. The first gentle sunlight in days spilled across Jake's small home, soft and golden after a relentless stretch of rain. Inside, the quiet was rare and sacred. Storm lay dozing on the wooden floor, his head resting on Ben's leg. The boy sat motionless, carefully coloring a new drawing. This time, Storm flying through the sky. Jake watched them from the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of coffee he'd forgotten to drink. Something in the stillness began to ease his heart, like the first thaw after a brutal winter. But the silence didn't last. A knock at the door. Jake opened it. Emily stood there, arms full, a bag of medication and a box of carefully portioned dog food. She was still in her white coat, hair tied high, her expression serious, but her eyes held something else, something deeper, heavier. "Do you have a moment?" she asked plainly. "I need to talk to you, about Storm." They sat at the small wooden table while Storm slept on the floor, and Ben, sensing the need for space, quietly took his sketchbook outside to the porch. Emily opened the bag and pulled out a thin film and a small, burned-looking electronic chip. She placed it on the table with the same care someone might use to set down a fragile, dangerous memory. "We found this during Storm's X-ray scans. At first it was hidden under scar tissue and bone. No one noticed it before." Jake frowned. "An ID chip?" Emily nodded. "A tracking chip like the kind used for registered pets. But this one was deliberately damaged. Someone tried to erase its trace." She flipped open the file to reveal a film scan. This fracture wasn't caused by an accident. The angle, the compression. This was blunt force trauma, likely from being stomped or thrown against something hard. And these circular bite marks all over his body. They weren't from Storm attacking. He was the one being attacked. Jake's hands clenched the edge of the chair. A cold numbness spread through his chest, down into his gut. Emily continued, her voice lower now, like trying not to wake something awful in the room. "Based on the injuries, his defensive behavior, and his fear of loud noises, I'm almost certain. Storm was used as bait in dogfights. He was there to be torn up. Trained dogs were unleashed on him while he wasn't allowed to fight back." Her words landed like a blade. Jake couldn't picture it. Storm, the same dog who rested his head in Ben's lap each afternoon, once chained in some pit, clawless, defenseless, used like a chew toy for blood training. And then, Emily swallowed hard, eyes falling to Storm. When he was no longer useful, they dumped him, left him in a cage, in a flood, to die. Jake stood and walked to the window. A breeze slipped through the curtain slits, bringing in the scent of damp wood and clean earth. But inside him, a storm raged. Not just anger, but something harder. Responsibility. "Can we trace who did this?" he asked, voice low and graveled. Emily shook her head. "The chip's unreadable. No data, no registry, no lost dog reports matching his description within a 100-mile radius." Jake looked down at Storm, twitching slightly in his sleep as if dreaming. Was he back in the mud, the chains, the darkness? Or was he dreaming of Ben and the colored sky? Emily stepped beside him, not touching, just standing near. "Storm is the victim of many cruel hands," she said softly. "But what's incredible is that he doesn't hate. He still trusts. He trusts me. You, especially Ben." Jake closed his eyes. Shadow's face, his war dog who once saved him in Afghanistan, flashed through his mind. Shadow had thrown himself into the fire for Jake, and now Storm, wrecked and weary, was saving him more quietly. Not with force, but with presence, with patience, with morning glances that waited for Jake to wake. "He deserves to know he wasn't thrown away," Jake whispered. "Not again." Emily nodded. "If there's anyone strong enough to help him heal, it's you." Jake turned to her. His eyes held hers without flinching. "Not just me," he said. "Us." She smiled. Soft. Real. For the first time in years, there was no distance between them. On the floor, Storm's tail gave a tiny thump in his sleep, as if he'd heard a promise too quiet for words, but loud enough to reach his bones. That night, after Emily had left, Jake sat for a long while on the porch beside Storm. The sky had cleared, revealing scattered stars, faint and worn like old memories weathered by time. Storm lay with his head on Jake's thigh, breathing steady and warm. This warmth, after all that Emily had said, now felt infinitely precious. Jake knew he couldn't walk away, not from Storm, not from the others like him, being still suffering in silence, hidden in the dark where no one was looking. He clenched his hand softly over Storm's back, a silent promise, a beginning. He didn't expect that promise to be tested so soon. The next morning, after a simple breakfast, toast and eggs for Jake, chopped boiled chicken for Storm, a knock came at the door. But it wasn't Emily's gentle knock or a neighbor's familiar tap. It was firm, dry, final, like a gavel. Jake opened the door. A stranger stood on the step, tall, wearing a faded black leather jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. His face was angular, cold, as if carved from stone. In his hand, a slim folder. Clipped to the front was a photo of Storm, curled in the rusted cage, scarred and broken. "Jake Carter?" The man's voice was flat, with a southern lilt, calculating eyes. "Yes," Jake replied, instinctively lowering a hand toward his side. A reflex from war. "Who are you?" "I'm the previous owner of that dog. His name's Kaiser. I'm here to take him back." Jake froze. Storm, lying near the door, had lifted his head curiously. But the moment the man said, "Kaiser," the dog jolted like struck by lightning, ears dropped, eyes wide, a low, trembling growl began in his throat. Jake didn't need more proof. He stepped outside and shut the door behind him, shielding Storm from view. "This dog's name is Storm," he said coldly, "and he doesn't want to go with you." The man didn't blink. He held out the file. "I have ownership papers, the chip matches. I've been searching for him for months. You're holding my property. If you don't return him, I'll sue." Jake didn't even glance at the file. His eyes were locked on Storm, peeking through the door crack. Trembling, backed into the far corner, eyes wild with panic. Not confusion. Memory. Trauma. "You don't need to say anything else," Jake said, voice iron. "I'm not handing Storm over, and if you're still here in 60 seconds, I'm calling the cops." The man narrowed his eyes. His lips curled into a crooked smirk. "The police won't be on your side. I've got documents." Jake stared him down, his voice calm and certain. "But I have the truth, and no dog ever trembles before someone they once loved." The man's jaw tightened. Fury flickered in his eyes, but he took a step back, adjusted his hat, and stuffed the folder into his jacket. Before turning to leave, he stared hard at Jake. "Fine, but this isn't over." Jake said nothing. He stood unmoving until the man's battered black car turned the corner and vanished. When the door closed behind him, Jake rushed to Storm. The dog was still trembling, pressed into the wall like trying to disappear. "It's okay, Storm," he whispered, kneeling beside him, hand gently on his head. "He's gone. You're safe now." Storm looked up. His eyes were wet, but the soft lick on Jake's hand said everything. He understood. He knew someone had chosen to stand beside him. Again. Jake pulled out his phone. Dialed. "Sheriff Warren, I need to report a threat. A man claiming ownership of a dog with clear signs of abuse just showed up. I have a vet witness, physical evidence, and now he's made contact." His voice didn't shake. For the first time in years, since the battlefield, Jake felt full again. Not with pain, but with something simpler, stronger. The quiet certainty that he was finally protecting what was right. The atmosphere inside the house grew heavier after the stranger left that morning. Storm lay close to the door, where Jake had always kept a small mat for her to watch the garden. But today, she watched nothing. Her ears drooped low, her eyes alert, and each time a car passed outside, she flinched. Jake didn't leave the house all day. He called Emily and told her everything. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before she said quietly, "We need to prepare for the worst." The worst came sooner than expected. 2 days later, a delivery worker handed Jake a thick envelope. The logo of a law office was stamped clearly on the corner. Jake opened it, scanning the cold words. An official lawsuit filed with the city court. The plaintiff claimed to be the legal owner of the dog named Kaiser and demanded immediate return of the illegally withheld property. Property. The word hit Jake like a punch. A living being who had been abandoned, abused, terrified, and was just beginning to heal was not an object. The storm was life, a companion, a witness to both the cruelty and grace of the world. The next day, Jake visited a lawyer friend, a former Marine turned civil advocate for veterans. Together, they filed an urgent response, including all of Storm's medical documents Emily had meticulously compiled. Still, nothing could prepare Jake for the judge's temporary ruling. Due to the legal dispute and the presence of an ID chip, albeit damaged, the court ordered Storm to be transferred to a public veterinary holding center until ownership was determined. She would not stay with Jake. She would not continue treatment with Emily. And worst of all, no one involved in the case would be allowed to visit her during confinement. The news cut deep, not just with helplessness, but like someone carving out the only thing that had been healing Jake's soul since the war. When the day came and they took Storm away, the sky was a lifeless gray, the cold biting. Jake tried to remain calm as he watched a court-appointed officer escort Storm into the vehicle. She didn't resist. She didn't claw or howl, but her silence was far worse. She simply pressed into the corner of the van, staring at Jake, not with anger or blame, but with a soft, aching question. "Why are you letting them take me?" Jake sat on the steps for a long time after, clutching the collar of the military coat he had once wrapped Storm in on that rainy night. It still held the faint scent of her fur, the damp warmth, the breath that had made him feel less alone. That night, the house felt hollow. Jake turned on every light, but all it did was expose her absence. The water bowl, the crumpled blanket, a half-chewed bone Storm had hidden behind the sofa. All are still there, but Storm was not. Emily was the first to call. "She stopped eating," she said quietly. "It's been 2 days. She won't eat, drink, or respond to anyone, not even the vet. She just lies there facing the wall and whimpers when someone walks by." Jake's heart shattered. He asked to visit, but was denied. To avoid influencing the investigation into rightful ownership, they said. He stood for hours outside the gates of the city holding center, watching cars come and go, wondering which cold concrete cell Storm was locked in. He'd felt this before. Back in the military, watching a teammate die in front of him because help didn't come in time. That same helplessness, that same rage. And now it returned, not in combat, but in the form of a dog, fragile and frightened, being ripped from the only arms she trusted. Jake didn't cry. But that night, he opened an old album. Next to the only photo he had of Shadow, his war dog who died saving him in Afghanistan, he placed a new photo. Storm curled up on a rug, her head resting on his leg, her eyes calm. For the first time in years, Jake dropped to his knees. Not for the war, not for old wounds, but for a being who couldn't speak, yet understood better than anyone what it meant to lose, and still wished to stay. "Wait for me, Storm," he whispered. "No matter what, I'm bringing you home." The next morning, just as Jake poured his usual strong black coffee, his phone rang. The voice on the other end was trembling. It was Mrs. Wilson, Ben's mother. "He's gone," she sobbed. "Ben's missing. He left a note. I think he's looking for Storm." Jake shot upright, heart pounding. He didn't ask many questions. He grabbed his coat and rushed out. Mrs. Wilson stood at her gate, pale and shaking, holding a piece of notebook paper folded in fours. Jake took it, eyes racing through the uneven handwriting. "I don't want Storm to die. I don't want her to be sad. I've felt like Storm before. Like if no one loved me, I'd just disappear. But Storm stayed with me when I drew. I understand her eyes. She has no one, so I'll stay with her. I'm sorry, don't worry." At the bottom, a pencil drawing. Storm, curled up, with a boy beside her, arms wrapped around her head. Messy hair, a quiet face. Jake felt something heavy settle in his chest. A child had seen what the legal system hadn't. Storm didn't need a name on paper. She needed love, safety, and a home. He moved fast. Within an hour, Jake had called in every neighbor he trusted. Word spread quickly. 10 people canvassed the area. Parks, malls, and alleys where Ben sometimes wandered. Emily left work mid-shift and drove straight to the public holding center, following her gut. Jake cruised through every street, eyes scanning, searching. In his mind, he saw Ben, the boy with quiet eyes who sat beside Storm for hours, never needing words to speak. 2 souls once broken, quietly healing each other. Near dusk, Emily called. "Jake," she said, her voice trembling. "You need to come here?" Jake's breath caught. He drove like fire. Outside the holding center's tall gate, beneath a small tree tucked in shadow, a tiny figure sat on the ground. Ben. The boy clutched his sketchbook and his backpack as a pillow. His eyes were rimmed with fatigue. His clothes were dirty. On the open page, a picture of Storm, not caged, not wounded, but running in a field of green, tongue out, eyes lit by sunshine. Jake approached slowly and knelt beside him. Ben looked up. No panic, just exhaustion, honesty. "I didn't want her to think no one needs her," Ben whispered. "I felt that way, like I'm just a weird kid everyone avoids. But Storm looks at me like I'm the most normal person in the world." Jake laid a hand on Ben's shoulder. "You're not weird, and Storm's not alone. You're both incredibly brave." Ben wiped his eyes, tears spilling freely now. "Will they let her die, Jake, if no one claims her?" Jake didn't answer right away. The center loomed behind the gate, cold and towering, but inside Jake, something had already solidified. "I won't let that happen," he said firmly. "Even if I have to take on the whole system, I'll bring Storm home. And if you want, maybe Storm will have a friend visiting every day." Ben looked up. His eyes, still wet, flickered for the first time with something new. Hope. A moment later, he fell asleep in Jake's arms, too exhausted to fight anymore. On the cold concrete of dusk, the drawing of Storm remained open, a dream not yet fulfilled but ready to be written. Jake stood, carrying Ben to the truck. But before starting the engine, he glanced once more at the holding center. A third-story window had been left slightly open. A warm yellow light spilled through the glass, and for a heartbeat, Jake thought he saw her. Storm. Still. Silent, but waiting. "Wait for me, Storm," he whispered. "This time, I'm not fighting alone." A quiet afternoon blanketed Jake's porch with the late, soft sunlight. But inside him, the storm was just beginning. Ever since Storm was taken away, the house felt unnervingly empty. No more tapping claws on the wooden floor. No more soft breathing from the corner. No more warm eyes following every step he took. Jake sat there, slouched in his chair, staring blankly at Ben's drawing on the table. The colored pencil sketch tilted slightly, the ink still smudged and damp. In it, Storm, thin but gentle, sat beside a child. They leaned on each other like two forgotten souls who had found the only warmth left in a cold world. Just hours earlier, little Ben, the quiet, autistic boy from next door, had snuck out into the night to look for Storm. The letter he left behind stopped Jake cold. "I don't want Storm to die. Just like I felt when no one loved me." The words were short and messy, but cut like a blade. Jake gripped the letter tightly. This was no longer just about a dog or a veteran haunted by war. The storm had become a lifeline, a thread binding broken lives together. And when that thread was severed, an entire little world began to crumble. Emily arrived not long after Ben was brought home safely. She sat beside Jake in silence. Then, without a word, she opened her laptop. With a quiet determination, her fingers trembled slightly as she typed. She didn't argue with legal codes. She didn't cite ownership rights or property laws. She told a story of a rainy night when an old soldier carried home a dying creature. A story about Storm's eyes that had once shut themselves off from the world, but flickered with warmth for the first time when a scarred hand touched her gently, as if soothing its past. Emily wrote, "I'm a veterinarian. I've met hundreds, maybe thousands of dogs, but I've never seen eyes like Storm's. She doesn't flinch, doesn't bite, doesn't growl. She just looks, like a soul that has lost everything but is still quietly waiting for someone to give her a reason to live." She went on, about the damaged chip embedded in Storm's neck, the suspicion she was once used as bait in dogfights, how she was rescued from a metal cage during a flood, only to be reclaimed by a cold man wielding ownership papers, while Storm cowered, trembling non-stop. About Storm being locked in a veterinary center as evidence in a custody dispute, refusing food, and lying motionless like a ghost for 3 straight days. The post ended with a photo of Storm sleeping next to Ben. The boy's hand rested on her back. 2 beings, 1 child, 1 dog, but somehow the same aching loneliness, keeping each other warm with just their presence. Emily added 1 line, "If you believe that wounded souls deserve a second chance, please share this story." The hashtag read, #Justice for Storm. Within 2 hours, the post had been shared over 10,000 times. Each share brought hundreds of tearful comments. "Storm isn't just an animal. She's a warrior. I lost my dog after the war. I know how Jake feels. My child is autistic too. The Storm is like a guardian angel for quiet children. Love shouldn't be treated like a disputed asset in court." Animal rights groups stepped in. The U.S. Veterans Association sent an open letter to the city court, pledging support for Jake. They wrote, "We don't leave our comrades behind, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. A group of pro bono lawyers offered Jake free legal support and launched a nationwide petition. Within 24 hours, over 150,000 signatures poured in. Local media spread the story. Strangers sent flowers to the holding center with notes saying, "Stay strong, Storm." A street artist painted a mural of Jake carrying Storm on his back in the rain. Every time the media mentioned Justice for Storm, Jake felt a small light flicker in his heart. A light he thought had died with shadow, his first four-legged comrade. One evening, Jake stepped onto his porch. On the wooden table was a stack of printed pages, the petition signatures, and messages from across the country. A single mother from Kansas wrote, "My son read about Storm. Today, for the first time, he hugged our dog." A vet from Seattle wrote, "I once treated a dog like Storm, but I failed. I hope we don't fail this time." Jake looked up at the night sky. "For the first time in years," he whispered, not to a fallen comrade, but to himself. "This time I won't lose her." And somewhere, among millions of people, a small campaign named after a dog began to stand for something far greater. Justice isn't just for humans. It's for any being that knows how to love. Like a quiet wave spreading across America, the numbered Justice for Storm campaign turned a flicker of hope into a blazing fire. That momentum, steady and unshakable, led to a morning Jake never thought he'd face. Stepping into a courtroom, not as a veteran, but as a man defending the one soul who had pulled him back from the brink of despair. The courtroom was packed. Some came out of curiosity. Many came out of belief. Others came because they knew the feeling all too well. When the world turns away, sometimes the only eyes that see you without judgment belong to a dog. Behind Jake stood Emily and Ben. Ben clutched the drawing of Storm he had redone, his hands trembling. Emily placed a quiet hand on Jake's shoulder, the kind of silent gesture people have always used to lend each other strength. The judge entered, face solemn, voice composed. The plaintiff, the same cold man who had come to Jake's door, presented a stack of documents, years-old ownership papers, faded photos, spotty vaccination records, cold, outdated paperwork. As Emily once said, they leave no room for emotion. Then came the defense. Jake stood. He wore his old uniform, no ribbons, no medals, just himself. A soldier who had seen many battles, but never trembled like this, facing the possibility of losing Storm. Jake's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "Your Honor, I'm not here as her owner. I'm here as someone who was saved." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Her name is Storm. I didn't give her that name. She chose it. By lifting her head in the rain, by surviving after being caged, abandoned, tortured, and still wagging her tail when I called." A quiet sob rippled through the back rows. Jake went on, voice quivering but eyes unwavering. "I once had a comrade, Shadow, the military dog who died saving me from a landmine in Afghanistan. Since that day, I couldn't touch another dog without hurting, until Storm. She didn't just survive. She made me want to survive too." Jake bowed his head. "I don't know how the law defines love, but I do know this. If she's taken away today, a part of me that war didn't get to will be lost forever." Emily followed. No medical jargon, no clinical terms, just the memory of the night Storm arrived. Bones fractured, eyes hopeless, tail too weak to wag. She told the court of the first time Storm lifted her head toward the light. At the sound of a child's laugh, she pointed to Ben. He sat between his parents, gripping his drawing of Storm. When called, Ben approached the stand with the hesitancy of a child used to avoiding people's eyes. But when he spoke, the courtroom held its breath. "My name is Ben. I'm not good at talking, but Storm understands me." He held up the drawing. "I made this when she was locked up. I thought if she saw it, she'd know I was still waiting. She's not just a dog. She's my first friend." The silence stretched long. There was no need for high-tech evidence. No need for fiery rhetoric. Storm had already spoken through every story told, not as a pet, but as a soul who knew pain, who knew love, and who knew how to forgive. After an hour of deliberation, the judge returned, eyes thoughtful. He spoke slowly. Each word weighted. "The law cannot quantify love, but it can protect life, compassion, and the invisible bonds that connect all beings." He looked straight at Jake and declared, "This court grants full legal custody to Mr. Jake Carter. Additionally, animal welfare organizations will oversee Storm's health for the first 3 months as part of a special transfer protocol. He struck the gavel. "This court is adjourned." Applause broke out, not the polite kind allowed in court, but the kind that bursts from relief, from hundreds witnessing a victory not just of legality, but of humanity. Jake held Ben close. Emily wept. And in that moment, no one thought about credentials, pasts, or even conditions of care. They only thought of one small creature who once lay exhausted in a cage during the rain, now finally called by her truest name: family. The courthouse doors closed behind them. But for Jake, it felt like another door had just opened, a door leading home, to a new beginning for both him and Storm. There were no cheers, no triumphant music. But when he looked into Storm's eyes, no longer clouded with fear but lit with a fragile trust, Jake knew they had become family, in a way stronger than blood. That very evening, Jake began to change. He didn't turn on the TV like he used to, drowning nightmares in meaningless noise. Instead, he laid his old army jacket on the floor beside the bed, patted it gently, and whispered, "Storm." She walked over cautious, weary, and laid her head on the worn fabric, still carrying the scent of gunpowder, sweat, and blood. Once, those smells haunted Jake, but now Storm exhaled softly, as if she'd found something familiar. And Jake did too. The next morning, golden sunlight spilled across the backyard of the weathered house. Jake began a project he never imagined, turning that yard into a place of healing. He pulled the weeds, used old planks to build a neat fence, and in the center laid a path of artificial grass, so Storm could walk without slipping. He erected a light canopy from the military tarp, where Storm could rest after each rehab session. He made a wooden frame with a small bell, training her to respond to its sound. Every time she lifted her injured paw and the bell chimed softly, Jake rewarded her, with proud eyes and a gentle stroke from hands that once only gripped a rifle. Nothing came easy. Storm still stumbled. At first she was afraid to move at all, lying still, eyes wide with panic, as if any step might bring her world crashing down again. Jake never rushed her. He sat by her side and told stories about Shadow, the dog who once saved his life on the Afghan battlefield, how Shadow too had to learn to walk again after an explosion, and how he became a legend in their unit. Storm listened, with quiet eyes and the faint twitch of a torn ear. Somehow she understood. A week later, Storm took her first step. Then another. Then she fell. But she got up again. And Jake, he laughed for the first time in years. Ben, the quiet boy next door, had by now become an unofficial member of this little family. After school, he'd knock on Jake's door, sketchbook in hand. He'd sit with Storm for hours, drawing her from every angle, resting, training, frowning, or simply watching Jake from across the yard. Ben's drawings began to show a softness Jake had never seen in his work before. And he knew Ben was healing too. Just like Storm. Just like him. Ben also helped Storm cope with strangers. One time, when Emily came over with scar medication, Storm let out a low growl, an instinct of a creature once tortured. But when Ben placed his hand gently on her neck and whispered, "It's okay," Storm relaxed. Emily froze for a moment, watching the boy. Later, she said that Ben had never touched anyone or any animal before Storm. Emily began visiting more often, not because of Jake, or at least she wouldn't admit it, but because of Storm. She brought meds and rehab toys and offered Jake gentle tips for physical therapy. And during the quiet moments when they both held their breath as Storm attempted her first hurdle, then sighed with relief when she made it over, something soft and warm began to return to their eyes. Something broken long ago when Jake left everything behind to go to war. One afternoon, with a light rain falling, Storm lay in the yard, her head resting on Ben's legs, while Jake and Emily sat under the porch, sipping coffee. No one spoke. The wind chime tinkled faintly. Ben whispered, "Storm's dreaming." Jake looked down. Storm twitched slightly, her paw curling. Emily said softly, Dogs dream when they feel safe. Jake didn't answer, but something inside him fell quiet, in the best way. Jake's nightmares started to change. No more corpses, explosions, or Shadow's eyes wide in death. Instead, there was Storm's shaky walk, Ben's giggles, and Emily's gaze watching them both. New, gentler memories began to fill in the old, shattered spaces. Jake started waking up earlier. He cooked with a portion just for Storm, let her rest her head on the carpet as he repaired her kennel, took her for short walks around the neighborhood. The neighbors, once skeptical, now called her by name. Some even left treats, soft biscuits or little plastic bones. Storm wasn't afraid of strangers anymore. She no longer recoiled when someone reached out. Instead, she lifted her head, wagging her tail. Slowly but surely. Jake, Storm, Ben, and Emily, 4 people, 1 dog, and countless broken pieces, were quietly building something unnamed, but whole, a home. The peaceful days passed, steady and rhythmic, as if life had found a new pulse after the storm. The small yard had become Storm's paradise, a place where she could now walk with her legs, no longer trembling. Ben slept better at night, and Emily began leaving warm cups of coffee on the porch each morning instead of offering awkward hellos. Jake smiled more, and in his eyes, the light that once died on the battlefield had begun to return. But as an unspoken rule of life often goes, calm moments sometimes herald the storm. That night, the air was still. The house sat quietly in a slumbering neighborhood. Jake had just lulled Storm to sleep after a long day of therapy. She lay on the soft mat beside his bed, breathing slowly and peacefully. The nightlight cast a soft glow over her fur, now fuller, silkier, almost hiding the scars that once made her shiver. Jake passed Ben's room, cracked the door, and saw the boy clutching his stuffed duck, murmuring in a dream. Everything seemed normal, until Storm jolted upright. No loud noise, no glass breaking, no door slamming, just something, a presence that made Storm tense, ears perked high, back arched. She growled, low but firm, enough to make Jake's nerves snap to attention. Then he heard it, the faint creak of the back door hinge. Jake's heart clenched. He didn't need time to guess. Instincts kicked in, deep, trained, and immediate. He motioned for Storm to stay down, but she had already risen silently, amber eyes glowing like fire. Jake grabbed the wooden stick he kept beside the bed. A habit, never expected to use it. The next sound came from the hallway. Not footsteps exactly, more like something being nudged, software, but enough to make Storm snarl and bolt forward, claws dragging against the floor, fury building with every movement. Jake followed. Just as the hallway light flicked on, he saw him, the same man who once tried to reclaim Storm. Dressed in dark clothes, cap pulled low, eyes cold and metallic. He stood at Ben's bedroom door. Storm was faster than Jake's shout. She roared, a deep, raw snarl that shook the house, a challenge hurled at every demon that ever tormented her. The man froze, instinctively stepping back. But Storm didn't bite. She planted herself firmly in front of Ben's door, 4 legs braced, ready to tear apart anyone who dared approach. Jake stepped up from behind. "One more step, and she won't stop growling," he said, voice low but hard as stone. The man backed away, holding something metal, a worn-out chain. Jake didn't hesitate. He pressed the panic button. Alarms blared, followed by the wailing siren of the new security system Jake had installed after Storm was nearly taken. Within minutes, red and blue lights flashed outside. Police subdued the intruder while Storm remained at her post, eyes locked on him until the gate clicked shut. Ben had woken up in the chaos. He opened the door a crack and saw Storm still growling softly. No one told him what to do. He simply walked over and laid his hand gently on her neck. "It's okay," he whispered. Storm lowered her head and nudged his palm, as if to say, "I know. I've got you." The next morning, the story spread quickly through the town. A dog once abused, once left to die, had become a hero, protector of the neighborhood's most vulnerable child. The press ran stories. Radio hosts called her the Guardian Shepherd. Ben's school held an honor ceremony. Jake, standing beside Storm, wore his old uniform for the first time in years at an award presentation hosted by the veterans community. Under the flashbulbs and applause, Storm didn't leap or howl or wag wildly. She simply stood by Jake, just like she once had on battlefields or during sleepless nights. A former soldier, a once abandoned dog, a special boy, a woman returning from the past with a mending heart. Together they were rewriting a story, not with guns or grief, but with a bond no words could contain. Since the night storm growled to alert of danger, the once peaceful neighborhood had taken on a tense, guarded atmosphere. Jake's windows, rarely shut before, were now always curtained and locked. Ben no longer drew on the porch alone. Jake, though outwardly calm, carried a constant alertness, like a reflex that never fully let go. What he didn't know was that everything was starting to change. This time, in a way that was visible and undeniable. One early weekday morning, while Jake was watering the small garden beds he, Ben, and Storm had planted in the backyard, a police car quietly pulled up to the curb. Officer Rivera, who had become familiar since the first time she visited Storm during her detainment, stepped out, a thick file in hand, her expression a mix of seriousness and barely concealed relief. "Jake," she called as she walked up the porch steps, "we have the preliminary investigation results." Jake set down the watering can and wiped his hands on his shirt. Storm stood from her corner in the yard, alert but not growling. She must have recognized the sound of familiar footsteps. Rivera sat on the porch steps, her gaze briefly resting on Storm with quiet affection before turning to Jake. "The man who broke into your home, his real name is Raymond Diaz, and this is bigger than just unlawful entry." Jake held his breath, waiting for every word. "We found a collection of forged documents in his car, chains with dried blood, a steel baton, and an electric shock device typically used in animal training. But more importantly," Rivera opened the folder and pulled out some printed photos. "He's been arrested twice before for running illegal dogfighting rings in the neighboring state. Both times he walked free due to lack of evidence." Jake's jaw tightened. "And this time he's not walking away," Rivera said firmly. "Thanks to Storm stopping him that night and the footage captured by your neighbor's security camera, we had enough cause to search his vehicle and reopen his criminal record. But it doesn't end there." She handed Jake a photo. It showed Storm, in a defensive stance at the gate, fur bristling, eyes fearless. The image had been clipped from a widely shared video. Over 200,000 shares in a single day, with the caption, "Abused dog saves child." "What about justice?" Rivera continued. "After the footage spread, 5 other families contacted us. All had lost dogs under suspicious circumstances. One family from the next state over kept the microchip of a dog with the same serial number series as the broken one found in Storm's neck." Jake froze. For a moment, his body felt numb. Years of unanswered questions were beginning to fall into place. "You might not know this," Rivera lowered her voice, "but Storm is the key piece in an ongoing investigation. Based on her injuries, scarring, and the damaged chip, we believe she was used as a bait dog, forced to stand still while aggressive dogs were trained to attack." Jake looked at Storm. His calm exterior cracked. The silver fur around her neck, the calluses at her joints, the way she flinched at the sound of metal. It all came together like a silent testimony. "Raymond Diaz has been arrested," Rivera confirmed. "He's being charged with 3 federal crimes: unlawful entry, animal abuse, and running an interstate dogfighting operation. We may add a charge for endangering a minor if we can prove he knew there was a child in the house." Jake clenched his fists. "Will Storm be safe?" "Absolutely," Rivera nodded. "And more than that," She may become the central witness and a national symbol in the fight against animal cruelty. Several organizations are offering to cover her surgery costs. There's even talk of awarding her an honorary medal. Storm, of course, didn't understand any of this, but as Jake sat beside her, wrapped an arm around her neck, and rested his forehead against hers, Storm tilted her head and gently licked his cheek. A simple gesture, but deeper than any thank you. Jake whispered, "She doesn't need a medal. She needs a family. And now, she has one." Rivera smiled softly. "I think we all need stories like this, not just to expose the evil, but to remind us, when kindness meets a creature once abandoned, it can come back to life, fight back, and even save lives." Silence hung for a moment. No one said another word, but in that stillness, something was quietly affirmed, that a journey once paved in pain was now leading toward the light. Storm wasn't just a survivor. She was living proof of cruelty, and the most beautiful testament that compassion can resurrect even the most shattered souls. As the tension of recent days faded into the past, the small town where Jake and Storm lived began to buzz with a different kind of energy, not from a festival or fair, but from something quieter, more solemn, a ceremony to honor a dog. But not just any dog. This was Storm, the soul once discarded, now recognized by the whole community as a hero. The story had spread far beyond the local news. National media dubbed her the four-legged warrior who saved a child and served as living evidence of animal abuse. Newspapers, veterans forums, and even international animal rights organizations sent their praise and offers of support. But the moment that moved Jake the most came from the United States Veterans Association, the same group that once memorialized fallen brothers beside him in foreign lands. They now wanted to present an unprecedented title, Honorary Soldier, awarded to a civilian dog. The ceremony was held on a warm spring morning at the small town square. The American flag waved under a clear blue sky. The rows of chairs were neatly arranged. Every gaze was fixed on the stage, where a simple sign read, "Honoring Storm, a symbol of courage and forgiveness." Jake wore his old uniform for the first time in years. His chest was steady. His hand gripped the leash as Storm sat calmly at his side. She showed no signs of anxiety. Her coat had grown thick again. Her eyes radiated a remarkable calm. Around her neck, a dark green bandana, one that once belonged to Shadow on his final mission. When the veterans representative took the stage, silence swept the square. In his hand was a silver medal, engraved with a star, and beneath it, "To Storm, for bravery beyond words." His voice, low and steady, carried emotion. In war, we've seen comrades who didn't wear a uniform give their lives to save a soldier. And today, in another kind of war, a creature once broken by mankind chose to protect one of us. We do not honor Storm because she is a dog. We honor her because she is a soldier in every sense of the word. He bowed and gently fastened the medal around Storm's neck. Applause erupted across the square. Whistles echoed. A few wiped away tears. Jake stood frozen. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting trembling shadows across his face. Then, in one simple but breathtaking moment, he bent down, kissed Storm's head, and whispered, loud enough for the microphone to catch, "I'm proud of you, soldier!" Storm turned her head and licked Jake's hand, as if to say, "I know." Next came Ben. The boy stepped forward, hair tousled, eyes shining. In his hands, a large crayon drawing. Storm in a Marine's helmet, sitting tall, with the American flag behind her, and scribbled text beneath. "Heroes don't have to speak." Ben handed the drawing to Jake, then turned to Storm and gently hugged her neck. "I drew this because you're the bravest friend I've ever had. You don't bark much, but you understand everything." Storm rested her head on Ben's shoulder, letting out the softest whine, not from fear, but from something close to gratitude. Emily stood in the front row, quietly wiping tears. Her eyes met Jake's. No words passed. They didn't need any. They both knew. Storm hadn't just healed a boy or a soldier, but had mended cracks they thought were sealed forever. The ceremony ended with a long-standing ovation. Storm lifted her head, metal glinting at her neck, and walked beside Jake through 2 rows of people saluting militarily. No one told her to, but Storm walked as if she had done it her whole life, each step a declaration that she was no longer a victim, but a living symbol of what love can bring back to life. And Jake, who once lost everything, was now smiling for real, for the first time in years, the kind of smile buried deep beneath the dry soil of war memories. He looked at Storm and whispered, "You're the gift I never dared to dream of." That day, the entire town rose to their feet for a dog. But in truth, they were standing up for something far deeper, the belief that sometimes the most sacred parts of our humanity are guarded not by the strongest, but by the ones who were once left behind. Since the day of Storm's tribute, the gentle morning when Jake's smile bloomed for the first time in front of an entire town, his rhythm of life had quietly shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was subtle, like sunlight filtering through the fog, the kind of light that signals connection, healing, and the slow return of humanity. Emily started visiting more often. At first, she claimed it was for Storm, each time bringing chicken stew or a new supplement for joint recovery she had just discovered. But none of the 3, Jake, Emily, or even Storm, truly believed that was the only reason. She didn't just bring medicine. She brought warmth, a piece of Jake's old life, now returning like the soft scent of a memory, familiar and alive. One afternoon, Emily came by with a stack of thick documents. She spread them out on the table, next to a cup of chamomile tea Jake had just brewed, and looked at him, her eyes serious yet filled with hope. "I've been thinking about something we could do together," she said. "Not just for Storm, but for people like you, and dogs like her." Jake quietly looked at the titles in front of him. Reintegration after trauma, animal-assisted therapy, healing veterans, and rescue animals. His hand paused over an old photo in one of the documents. A young soldier holding a military dog on a dusty battlefield. "I think if anyone's qualified to speak about this," Emily continued, "it's you." Jake didn't answer immediately. But Storm, who had been resting nearby, shifted her body and limped gently over to place her head on his lap. In her loyal eyes, Jake heard the kind of encouragement that needed no words. He nodded. That evening marked the beginning of a project. Small, built in a quiet suburban home. But its impact would reach far beyond those brick walls. Together, Jake and Emily began designing a community program for veterans with PTSD and individuals who had adopted, abused, or abandoned animals. At first, only a handful signed up. An elderly man who served in Iraq, a young woman who rescued a battered cat, and a returning soldier from Syria who never spoke and always sat in the back. But word spread, not through media, but through results. Jake never called himself a healer. He just told his story, about Shadow, about Storm, about the dream he left behind in the burning sands of the Middle East and rediscovered in a rain-soaked alley. Emily, with her expertise and a heart softened by the years, helped others identify their pain, acknowledge it, and gently fold it away like an old letter. Not to destroy, but to keep it in a deeper, quieter place. Storm was present at every session. She didn't speak, but her presence alone, the way she bowed her head when a man choked up recounting a fallen comrade or gently leaned against the leg of a teenager who had just adopted a blind dog, was enough. One evening after class, Jake and Emily lingered longer than usual. A light breeze swept across the wooden porch, carrying the scent of pine and someone's freshly baked cookies. They watched Storm, resting her chin on Ben's legs. Ben, now open, smiling, and retelling stories through his drawings, no longer hiding in silence. Emily spoke softly, as if gently reminding them both. If you hadn't stopped the car that night, if you hadn't stepped out of your safe zone, none of this would have happened. Jake smiled, not the cautious kind he used to offer, but a real smile, warm and quiet. He didn't reply. He simply placed his hand over hers for the first time in years, no longer two old flames colliding by chance, but two people walking forward together into something new. Storm lifted her head, as if sensing something stretched, and quietly nestled herself between them. Jake and Emily laughed. Nothing had to be said. They understood. Storm hadn't just brought a discarded dog back to life. She was slowly mending the broken pieces of others too. This time, two hearts that had once been too wounded by war to meet again. As dusk melted into evening, they stood there, a man haunted by war's nightmares, a woman once wounded by her choice to leave, and a dog who had been chained to the worst of human cruelty. Three souls now learning together how to walk toward the light. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees behind the house, falling gently on a drawing Ben had hung at the entrance. A dog in a soldier's helmet, its large eyes full of kindness, drawn with lines still clumsy but deeply sincere. Beneath the drawing, Jake had quietly fastened a hand-carved wooden plaque. Shadow's Shelter, a place for wounded souls to begin again. The idea for the rescue center came one unexpected evening, while Jake, Storm, and Emily were cleaning out the old shed behind the piece of land Jake's mother had left him. As they tugged at dusty tarps, they stumbled across Shadow's old collar, still smeared with military paint and faintly inscribed with the words, "Protect, defend, love." The phrase echoed in Jake's mind, like a vow that had waited silently to be spoken. "Maybe it's time we make this place into something more," Jake whispered, eyes fixed on the collar. Emily turned, recognizing the resolve reawakening in his eyes. She didn't ask further. She simply nodded, then knelt beside Storm, the dog who watched them with patient eyes, as if already knowing the future rising from the ashes. Within weeks, the garden was cleared, fences rebuilt, and a row of clean, airy kennels constructed with the help of fellow veterans. They didn't ask for explanations. They simply showed up, with hammers, wood, and stories of their own, men who had known loss and wanted now to build something hopeful. Shadow's Shelter officially opened on a gentle autumn morning. Storm was the first resident. But just days later, more dogs arrived. Each one a story, a scar, a gaze that once had no trust left. Ben showed up nearly every day, always with his sketchbook full of dog portraits. He became the unofficial emotion translator. He didn't need to say much. He just sat beside a new arrival and sketched its face, and through that single image, people could tell what it needed. Fear, hunger, or simply a gentle touch. Emily led the therapeutic efforts, from light training to group talks with adopters. What once were classroom lectures became casual porch sessions, with Storm always at the center, a living symbol that healing is real. Jake, once a silent veteran, buried under emotional rubble, was now the leader of the shelter. He taught recovery skills to traumatized dogs, not with commands, but with trust. He spoke to them like he once spoke to Shadow, like he had whispered to Storm on that first rainy night. Sometimes, at the end of the day, he'd stand before the shelter's sign, hand resting on the engraved words, and murmur, "We're still fighting. But this time, it's for life." One afternoon, a boy came to the shelter with his mother, recently freed from an abusive marriage. The boy didn't speak. He just stared at Storm with cautious, almost doubtful eyes. Storm slowly approached. No force, no excitement. She simply lay down, resting her chin on his foot. The boy said nothing but returned the next day. And the next. On the fifth day, he finally spoke. "I want to draw her." Jake and Emily exchanged a look. Nothing more needed to be said. Storm, once again, had rescued a small soul wandering through brokenness. Shadow's Shelter was not a massive facility, but it was a home, a place where every dog once beaten, abandoned, or used as a tool was now given a new name, seen as a feeling being. A place where veterans like Jake could find laughter again between memories of fire and shrapnel. and a place where children like Ben could learn to love and be loved, not through words, but through the quiet bond between human and animal. Storm, now affectionately called Honorary Manager, did her morning rounds daily. She moved more slowly, her once broken leg leaving a soft imprint with each step, but her gaze had never been stronger. Whenever a new dog arrived, she was the first to approach, to sniff, to lie beside them as if to say, "We've been hurt, but now we're safe." And in the quiet evenings, as the lights dimmed in the shelter, one man always sat on the porch beside his dog. Two survivors, now keepers of the flame. Jake would tell Storm about Shadow, about battlefields, about how a dog once taught a broken man to trust again, and Storm, as always, would rest her head on his knee, eyes peaceful, as if to say that in the end, everything had found its rightful place. Even as Storm became a living symbol of rebirth, she still carried the silent weight of an injury not yet fully healed. Her left hind leg, badly broken, and only temporarily splinted when Jake had rescued her from the flood-soaked cage, was beginning to swell again. Her brave strides had grown stiff and heavy, and each step seemed to sap more strength. Jake couldn't ignore it. Emily was the first to bring up the idea of reconstructive surgery. After consulting with the head veterinarian at the shelter, they agreed to transfer Storm to a specialized animal hospital in the city, where surgeons could restructure the damaged bone. Jake nodded his consent, but the worry in his eyes couldn't be hidden. To him, Storm wasn't just a dog. She was a comrade, a lifeline, a bridge between the shattered past of war and a present full of fragile hope. On the day of the operation, the entire shelter fell into a hush. Ben drew a new picture and carefully taped it to Storm's medication bag, a cartoon of a dog in a doctor's hat, with shaky but loving words below. "Be strong, Storm." At the hospital, the medical team administered anesthesia and began the complex procedure with the precision of those who knew they weren't just healing a body, but restoring freedom to a soul long chained. The surgery lasted nearly 4 hours. Jake sat outside the whole time, gripping Shadow's old military collar like a silent talisman. When the surgeon finally emerged, removing her mask with a relieved smile, all Jake could say was, "Thank you." He was ushered into recovery soon after, where Storm lay still under a thin blanket, a small IV in her leg, heart monitor beeping steadily. She hadn't awakened yet, but the light in the room, soft and warm, brought Jake back to that night he first held her in the cold rain. He pulled a chair close and rested his hand gently on the fur at her neck, whispering words only she might ever hear. Maybe they were stories about Shadow, maybe apologies, maybe just a quiet thank you to the creature who had saved him in a way no one else ever had. That night, Jake never left the hospital. Emily sent dinner from the shelter, and Ben called over the video, holding up a sign. "Storm is a superhero." Jake smiled softly, never taking his eyes off the sleeping warrior beside him. Near dawn, beneath the dim lights of the recovery room, Storm stirred. A faint whimper escaped her, and her head lifted weakly. Her eyes, dulled by anesthesia, blinked open slowly, and in one long, quiet second, they met Jake's, the gaze not of owner and pet, but of two wounded souls soothing each other's pain. She didn't bark. She didn't move much. She just inched forward and gently licked the hand resting near her face, as if to whisper, "I'm okay. I know you're here." Jake tilted his head, eyes moist, a soft smile breaking across his face. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in the sterile quiet of a hospital. Beside him lay Storm, not a soldier with medals, but a fighter with a heart larger than any rank. And from that moment on, they both knew. Even though the journey ahead would still be long, even though scars needed time to heal, they would walk it together, not just for the past, but for every soul still waiting for hope inside Shadow's shelter. Storm, with a healing leg and an undefeated heart, was ready to write the next chapter. Not as a victim, but as living proof of the power of love, recovery, and unwavering loyalty. Storm's full recovery began, this time not marked by resistance, but by rebirth. Jake brought her home to Shadow's shelter in his old pickup truck, but with a different spirit, no longer weighed down by fear or sleepless nights in hospital rooms. Storm sat in the back, head leaning against the cracked window, the breeze brushing over her shaved fur. Her eyes were quiet but calm. To Jake, she wasn't just returning. She was being reborn. In the early days, she still needed a brace and moved slowly. But Ben's presence, with the boundless hope of a special child who believed in all good things, was the best medicine. He named her first few steps like they were new planets. Mars step, Venus step, shouting with joy each time she completed a new move. Under Jake's hands and Emily's careful supervision, Storm began intensive physical therapy, underwater walking, light tendon stretches, and reflex coordination exercises. But the true miracle wasn't in the physical exercises. It was in the light returning to Storm's eyes. One weekend afternoon, Jake brought Storm to a therapy center for children with developmental disorders. They didn't expect it to be a turning point. A little girl with Down syndrome had sat silently in the corner for 2 sessions, not speaking, not engaging. But as Storm calmly walked over and lay down beside her, without prompting, the girl slowly reached out and stroked her head. Storm didn't move, only nuzzled her hand, as if to say, "I'm here, it's okay." From that day forward, the center requested Storm as a regular therapy companion. A new role, but one that felt destined for her. Storm didn't need to perform tricks. She didn't bark or do anything flashy. Her presence, patient, gentle, steady, was enough to make even the most guarded children sit still. She rested beside them as they learned to write, laid her head on their knees when they cried, and nudged their hands gently when she sensed they needed one more breath to get through an emotional storm. Jake, once a soldier carrying the darkness of war inside him, now stood beside Emily during presentations at the center. They spoke of Storm's journey not as a tale of triumph, but as living proof that creatures once abandoned can carry the power to heal. And Ben, the boy who once feared speaking, who only communicated through drawing, now stood confidently before a small classroom, hugging Storm and saying, "This is Storm. She's my first real friend." At that moment, every wall, between human and animal, between past and present, between pain and healing, disappeared. Storm was no longer a victim. She was no longer just a witness to cruelty. She had become a symbol of recovery, a quiet testament that kindness, if nurtured at the right time, ripples outward in waves that never end. She, with the leg that once broke and the eyes once dulled by fear, now walked gently beside Jake through the shelter's garden at sunset, as if the world had never been unjust. And in the hearts of those who had met her gaze, there would always remain a soft, enduring place for the miracle called faith. After those golden afternoons in the therapy garden, where Storm patiently accompanied the children and Jake silently watched over the healing of both her and himself, it felt as though every wound had finally healed. But the pain from war rarely announces its return. That night, a soft rain fell. The little wooden house where Jake lived seemed peaceful on the outside, but inside, the air thickened. In a restless sleep, images from Afghanistan surged back. He saw himself surrounded, bombs exploding, dust, blood, and the sound of desperate screaming. He called out Shadow's name, then came the final explosion, swallowing everything alive. Jake jolted awake, drenched in sweat, chest heaving, his fists gripping the bedsheets. In that fleeting moment, he felt like he was falling back into the darkness he had believed he'd escaped. He reached trembling fingers to his forehead. Tears rolled down, not just from fear, but from a memory no one else could understand. No one, but one creature. Storm had heard him. Without a sound, She pushed the door open with her nose, her steps uneven but quiet. She approached the bed, gently nudging Jake's hand with her head. He turned. In the dim light of the night lamp, Storm stood there, not afraid, but fully present. Her gaze was steady, patient, an unspoken call. I'm here. And I know. Jake broke down. The shoulders that had carried fallen comrades, that had withstood loneliness amid crowds, now shook from the simple touch of a creature once abandoned, once broken just like him, and now here, to show they could both still live, and live fully. Storm jumped onto the bed, uninvited, as if she knew that the boundaries of old no longer mattered. She didn't make a sound. She just curled up beside him, resting her head on his chest, her breath syncing with his pounding heartbeat. Jake held her gently, her body lean but warm, and whispered through sobs, "Thank you, Storm." In the darkness, he felt Shadow's warmth too, as if his old comrade's soul had always been nearby, watching from afar, and had sent Storm to finish what he could, not just to save Jake from war, but from himself. That night, for the first time in years, Jake slept peacefully. No bloodied dreams, no explosions echoing, no desperate cries, just Storm's steady breathing and the safety of a presence that blanketed them both like a quiet, eternal shelter. And when dawn crept in through the window, Storm was still there, not just as a rescued dog, but as a friend, a comrade, a piece of Jake's soul that he thought he had lost forever. Their story, from a man who lost everything to a dog who had been thrown away, was no longer about pain. It was proof that even the deepest scars, if touched by true compassion, can become the beginning of a new dream, one without nightmares. Since the night storm woke Jake from his nightmare with a soft, loving lick, everything seemed to shift. The fractures in his soul, once thought permanent, began to mend, stitched not with grand promises, but with quiet moments of presence, gratitude, and shared life. Storm had become more than a rescue. She was the glue that bound broken pieces into something not just whole, but deeply meaningful. A true home. That evening, the sunset painted the backyard in soft gold. The sky was cool, clouds drifting like old memories passing gently overhead. On the familiar wooden porch, Jake sat between the two people fate had brought back into his life. Emily, gentle and grounded beside him, and Ben, who no longer drew lonely pictures, now cheerfully coloring Storm's fur with joyful lines on a new page. Storm lay curled at Jake's feet, her head resting on his knee, eyes half closed but ears alert. Still the habits of a warrior who had never fully stopped standing guard. Her fur had grown thick again, the scars now just muted patches, no longer painful, but lasting proof. Emily held a cup of tea, her head resting lightly on Jake's shoulder. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Storm said it all, through her calm, steady presence. Not everyone understands the feeling of rediscovering a lost part of themselves in the eyes of a dog once deemed worthless. But Jake understood. Emily understood. And now, so did Ben. The boy sat close to Storm, gently stroking her velvet soft coat. His eyes filled with a quiet love no words could ever capture. In his hand was a green thread tied into a heart shape, a gift he planned to loop around Storm's neck. She didn't react with excitement. She simply licked his hand. A silent yes. Jake watched the scene, his heart rising with a feeling he couldn't name. Something in that moment made him want to pause time. Not as a man who had merely survived, but as someone finally, truly living. He leaned down, brushing Storm's head. She shifted, pressing closer against him. Jake's voice was low, warm, just loud enough for all three to hear. "Storm, you're not just a dog. You're this family's second chance." Emily smiled, placing her hand gently over his. Ben nodded as if he understood perfectly. And Storm, she didn't bark, didn't move, didn't need words, just let out a long, peaceful breath, closed her eyes, and surrendered to the hush of the sunset breeze brushing through the old porch rails. At that moment, everything was whole. Family isn't built by blood alone. It begins with trust, with those who choose to stay, to endure pain together, and to write a new story stitched with resilience and unconditional love. And so, in a backyard bathed in fading daylight, beneath a sky slowly turning to night, a new family was born, quietly, completely. Jake, Storm, Emily, and Ben, their story wasn't just one of a soldier and a dog healing together. It was a reminder of compassion, resilience, and the power to rise from the darkest places. If you've ever had a moment with a dog, or any animal, that changed your life, share your story in the comments below. We'd love to listen and help spread more light like this to the world. Don't forget to like, share this video with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story that just might change a heart. Thank you for staying with us to the very end. See you on the next journey.